Welcome to the Reconciliation Project podcast, where we are formed by faith and informed by science. I'm Sam.
I'm Hunter.
And we are hoping to do this podcast kind of as a way to inform people on what really is going on with faith and science. A lot of people say that it's in conflict, and so we're kind of posing the question, is it not, and how does that work?
Yeah, in my experience, especially in the church, Christians seem to want to put off science as if it's something that we can just ignore and kind of, in a way, pretend it's not there. Because over the past decades, really, we've seen an increase in what seemed to be a conflict between faith and science, and how both in the scientific community and in the view of a Christian / the church, that the two have to be kept separate, that the two can't go together whatsoever, and that you have to pick a side. You either have to pick science or you pick faith. And for a Christian, that means rejecting everything science says, or for someone who's in the scientific community, completely rejecting faith. In this podcast, we wanted to address what seems to be a conflict and try to resolve what Christians may see as a conflict and show that there really isn't so much of a conflict when you really look into the science and what it says, as well as what the Bible says.
Yeah, agreed. I think definitely, especially for Christians and people of faith, just disregarding science altogether is not wise or helpful. Science is something that affects a lot of daily life, especially for life in the United States. It affects country policy on things like abortion, euthanasia, medical care, etc. Even when we had COVID a couple years ago, that was a huge issue where there was a lot of misinformation coming out, and many people chose to hide under a rock and not face the science, or say, oh, the science is perfect and it's great, we're good to go, when really that may not have been the case. And now we're seeing some of those issues start to arise. And, while the church definitely is not characterized by its belief of science, we fully believe that the church should maintain its foundation on Jesus saves and the Bible is important. Science is still something that we have to deal with, and that's not something that we can just bury our heads in the sand about. We wanted to kind of bring in some of why science is important and how to better understand it. We've had this discussion multiple times. You don't have to be a PhD to understand science and evolution and that type of thing. Truthfully, some of it can almost be borderline common sense. You've seen that a good bit, especially with some of the things we've seen even in school when we were getting our bachelor's.
You really don't even have to get a college education in science to really understand just how complex. And you actually hear from a lot of people, most notably Bill Nye, the science guy, that if you just learn more about science and what evolution means, and what evolution is, and really just overall what the science teaches, if you just learned more, if you knew more, you would see that faith just can't be possible, that creation can't be possible. But in our perspective, it's quite the opposite. The more you learn about science, the more you learn about the complexity of God's creation, you see just how impossible it is for everything that we see around us to come randomly.
Ex nihilo, yeah.
Without any sort of guidance whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is also part of the other reason we had wanted to discuss this as well, was because so many times the scientific community and people who kind of follow more of the science and are more in that realm day to day tend to have the opinion that, oh, well, if you don't believe evolution is real or science works or blah, 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 then you're just dumb or you don't actually understand how any of it works. And we know that's not true. Both of us, I think, started out really enjoying science at an early age. That wasn't necessarily something that was oh yeah, we definitely, rejected evolution right away. But I think as we've continued to look into the science and kind of see some more of the common sense, it's really kind of raised some questions and been a little odd to us in some ways just to see the incontinuities or the discontinuities that we're seeing between evolution and what the rest of science even says, which is starting to become an issue with schools. Schools in the United States are starting to push evolution as the main source of where life came from and how life developed and where we see the diversity of life coming from, which is all fine and good if that's what you want to believe. We're not here to push any buttons or tell people what to believe. That said, there is a large portion of that is not fully told and not fully explained. And there are other points of view that aren't being explained either, which we would like to get into on this podcast, really to get a broader overview so that people can understand and really be able to do some of their own research, even to dive deeper and see what's more common sense and what's just being pushed by the scientific community or by the Christian community, either way.
A couple of things on what you said. One, you see a lot on both sides, whether it be in a faith community or in a scientific community. Both sides can kind of have a similar rhetoric of, oh, if you disagree with this, then you're stupid.
Or you're not a Christian, or whatever.
I've seen several instances where someone in the scientific community or a scientific group as a whole has made it abundantly clear that if you disagree with what they're saying, that you really either can't do science, or, in the words of Bill Nye, that you can't be a good citizen, or similar things like that. And on the flip side, you'll see in churches where a Christian or a Christian group will say, oh, if you think this about science, then, oh, you're not a good Christian, or that your faith is iffy, that your faith is questionable, and Jews don't have a real faith. You see this on both sides, in my opinion, and even within both groups, because there are, like within Christian science communities with young Earth versus old Earth, this sort of thing, which we'll get into probably in a future episode. Some of them will even go as far as to say, oh, if you don't agree with this, then you are wrong. Like there's so much of this, if you don't agree with us, therefore you are wrong, you are bad, whatever. I think it becomes more of a debate between groups when it really shouldn't be just a debate. It should be more of a discussion of the facts, discussion of what science teaches and what the Bible teaches, and looking at how the two really aren't in conflict when you look at the facts as they are versus how they're interpreted. One other thing you mentioned with teaching of evolution in schools, this has been going on for a while, long time. The issue of teaching evolution in schools has been quite a heated issue for a while. Back in 1925, we had what was called the Scopes monkey trial, where a high school teacher named John Scopes in Tennessee was accused of and arrested for violating the Butler Act, which was a law in Tennessee that prohibited the teaching of human evolution in public schools there in the state. He was fined ultimately $100 because he was found guilty, but the ruling was later overturned due to a technicality, and the law itself was eventually struck down completely. This was really kind of a turning point for teaching of evolution in schools. As we've continued to get past this point, it's just gotten more and more common to where today the theory of evolution is the only explanation for the origin of life taught in schools, and it's taught as fact, and it's presented in a way that overlooks the scientific issues surrounding the theory itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially given that this is being taught to children, you have to be really careful with that regardless of what you believe, because when you are teaching children anything, if it is taught as fact and not taught in the full scope of what's all there, that can very easily read into indoctrination. Obviously, Christians have been accused of that for centuries, and so we understand a little bit about that, but that also can go both ways on the scientific community as well, and that's important to know and to be able to have those discussions with your children and students, just to be able to have the conversation and say, hey, yes, this is being taught, and yes, this is important to know, but here are some of the issues with it. Here are some of the things that you're not hearing with it as well.
One of the goals of this podcast is to help the parent of these kids who are going through middle and high school. If their kid comes home and says, hey, mom, or hey, dad, I remember learning in Sunday school that God created everything, but my teacher today told us that everything happened randomly, that we are descendants of monkeys or something like that. Mm-hmm. So we want to try to help address these issues and help enable a mom or a dad who's facing this question to be able to answer their child with something that's not just, this is not what the Bible says, therefore they're wrong.
Yeah.
But being able to actually explain to their child, hey, that's not what we believe as Christians, and here's why. But not only that the Bible teaches that this is wrong, but also looking at some of what the science teaches as well.
And even not just parents as well, pastors, youth group leaders. This is not an isolated issue just to the nuclear family. This is an issue that is becoming more prevalent in the church as a whole, which needs to be dealt with, and dealt with in a loving and kind manner, not in a way that's blaming or sparking debate to the point where it is you're wrong, you're dumb, and you can't be a good Christian or anything along those lines. That's not helpful. That's not loving. That's not what God or Jesus has called us to do. And we need to be able to have these discussions and be able to help our children and help those that are starting to learn this and come alongside them and help them understand that, hey, this is not the only theory. There are more theories than this. And oh, by the way, not all those theories are fully correct either. There are some of those theories that also have really fundamental issues that aren't talked about. And evolution also has those issues. So it's not a one size fits all to, oh, this is correct, this is incorrect. That's one of the issues that we have to deal with science. Science is a method to learn about the world God has given us. It is a step-by-step process. That said, that step-by-step process can really get messed up if we choose to operate under false assumptions, if we don't consider other avenues for why XYZ may be happening. There are ways that science can go wrong, which I don't want to have to say because obviously I love science, but science is sometimes incorrect. Just because science shows something or quote unquote proves something, which it never does, that doesn't mean that that's the correct and functioning theory, and therefore that's what needs to be accepted moving forward, as has what's happened with evolution. I think obviously, based on what we've been discussing thus far, I think most listeners that would be, hearing this so far, I think would definitely be able to tell that both of us are Christian. And again, as we mentioned earlier, this is not a podcast to point fingers or black and white say this is wrong and this is right. That's not what we're doing here. And we're not even trying to say, oh, you need to think this way or that way. That said, this is kind of an experiment to see if we can't help people change their thinking a little bit about science and see the opportunities that are there. That said, I think with how that works, and especially as people of science and God both, we think that it's important to show exactly what we both believe and say what we both believe so that those listening at home can kind of take that into account. You can say, okay, I disagree with you on this topic, but fill in the blank there.
My testimony is not like you'll hear people's testimonies that are big and fancy, had this big radical change. I never had that. Really, I've been in church my entire life, and small Baptist church in the little upstate of South Carolina. So I've always been exposed to the teaching of God, the teaching of the Bible. There was a point in my life where I was like, okay, yeah, I want to be saved. I want to make a decision. Later on in life, when I was in high school, I realized I didn't actually make a true decision. At that point, I realized I needed to make that decision once and for all to make an ultimate, okay, do I want to make a commitment, which I didn't know about when I first made a decision, quote unquote. I would consider myself having been a Christian ever since that moment in high school. Still within that young age that a lot of people get saved at, but not as young as a lot of people.
Especially in our tiny corner of South Carolina upstate where there's a church on every corner.
Not really anything too fancy to mine, but ever since then I have felt one that I have continued to grow both in faith as well as in knowledge of science. It was actually right before that time where I was first exposed to the concept of apologetics, which is the defense of a particular belief. You can be an apologist for anything, really. You don't have to be a certain belief system. It can be for anything. For me, my first exposure to apologetics was the year before I came to what I consider to be true knowledge of God. And ever since then, I've always loved learning about defending my faith and about all these issues where people might come up and have questions or have objections to what we believe. And my most favorite part of it is the science and faith conversation. So ever since both the apologetics exposure back in 2018 and becoming a Christian in 2019, ever since then, both my faith and knowledge of science have continued to grow. Well, here I am now, hoping to help others to not reject either thing, because I don't want anybody to reject their faith and I don't want anybody to reject science either, because both are important. I believe science is a way for us to glorify God by studying his creation. I think it would actually be dishonorable to God if we were trying to push off the study of his creation and pretend like it didn't exist, because the more we study God's creation, the more we see how great and complex creation is. It just shows how great he is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I'm kind of in the same boat as you. For everybody else who's listening, I actually grew up in a place that was not as religious. Good old state of California, gold rush. And so there wasn't a church on every corner, but somehow I ended up in church and I accepted Christ. I joke on Tax Sunday, of all things, which is hilarious. And I accepted Christ then, but truthfully, I don't think I really understood what that meant or what that came with. And while I still kind of had all the churchy answers and had, my share of time in church, I was there anytime the doors were open. I had all that, but I didn't really have what most people would be considered a saving knowledge or a saving faith. And it actually kind of let me spiral for a little bit. I ended up thinking, oh, I don't have a great testimony. Let me make one, of all things, which, as stupid as that sounds now, that was what I believed at the time. And so I ended up kind of walking away a little bit for a while. And it took me till kind of a darker place in my life, kind of sophomore year of college, that I really realized, hey, this is not what God has ever wanted for me. Not to be prosperity gospel of, oh, he just wants you to be happy and have a full life and all this. That's not necessarily true. We are told that we'll experience trials, but he's wanted my heart all along, and it doesn't matter how I got there. And he just needs me to come as I am, which I chose to do. And so I've had a little less time being a true Christian, I would say. Not that there's a real scale for that, but, it took me a little bit to kind of get my stuff together and realize that I needed to not have everything together before I came to God. But, at that same time, I was also in a Christian university that was also teaching science from the perspective of, hey, really think about what's going on here. You're told this, that, and the other. Is that contradictory to what you've heard before? Is that contradictory to what you've learned before? And some of it really was. There are some things, even within evolution, which I know we'll cover this later, but, it's the topic of, oh, this randomly occurred. When in biology, lesson 1 is everything has a function. If it doesn't have a function, it's not going to come. And so that was really kind of odd to me, and honestly was actually something that helped my faith. My faith has a function. I have a function, even if I didn't feel like I did at the time. There are things to be discovered within science and within myself that I didn't, see right away or acknowledge right away. And that was not something that I needed to necessarily push. It would come when it came. All that to say, we obviously, as Christians, we believe that the telling of testimonies is important, and especially in something like this, although we are not full-on PhDs, I don't think that's necessarily something that's needed. The PhD isn't needed to understand and talk about what science is doing in the world right now. That said, if we're going to have a Christian component to this podcast and have this banter back and forth, we both felt that it was necessary to have some of that discussion of what our testimonies were and are continuing to be, as we continue with what 1 Peter 3:15 advises, kind of with understanding your beliefs and knowing the reasons behind them, as you mentioned with apologetics. So
yeah, and I feel like something that's lacking in the church today is the study of apologetics, both not only in science but in many other fields, whether it be with the resurrection, the most important cornerstone of our faith, or with things like the flood or abortion or various other things. Churches today and for a long time have kind of remained silent on all these issues, which I think is part of why these issues have arisen to the level that they are today.
Oh, 100%. That's one of the things that we're seeing with people walking away from the faith, is they don't have a why.
And there are people out there who are wondering, what is truth? The question Pilate asked Jesus when he was about to go to the cross is, asked, what is truth? And a lot of people, I think, are wondering today, what is truth? And Christians maybe have an answer, well, yeah, Jesus died for your sins, which is great, that's true. But some people want to know more than that, especially those who have grown up in secular backgrounds or in a secular school or whatever the case may be. And when we can't answer those questions, I think that's what pushes people away from the faith. Not that we're doing it intentionally, but I think when we can't give not only an answer, but a reason for our faith and why we believe what we believe, it makes it harder to do what Jesus tells us in the Great Commission, to make disciples. It makes that a lot harder. And I think for me, the point of apologetics isn't to win a debate. It's not to win an argument. It's to help address people's concerns and their questions to then open that door to share the gospel. And if you're doing resurrection apologetics, that's a great way, because we're looking at the cornerstone of our faith. But in science apologetics, it's very similar. We're looking at God's creation, and that opens the door to, well, God made everything perfectly. Well, what went wrong? Why are we here where we are today? And to me, it opens up various pathways to sharing the gospel, which is our ultimate purpose as Christians.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we teach each other how to defend our faith, because in my opinion, it's more important now than ever to know how to defend our faith. And I've seen in my church and other Christian groups that apologetics is really neglected. And I think that's really hurting the faith. Do I think that's the most important thing in our faith? No, the most important thing is sharing the gospel. But apologetics, I think, is right there with it. Because if you cannot answer people's questions and help them understand what we believe and why we believe it, sharing the gospel is going to be near impossible. Yeah,
absolutely. That's very well said. With the time we have left, we wanted to just explain some else of what this podcast kind of will and won't be. Obviously, we'll be covering quite a few different scientific topics and more faith-related topics as well. We'd like to cover various things. Again, you mentioned apologetics. We likely will cover some evolution. Here and there, we probably will cover some recent findings in the scientific community and how that relates to current events. But we also would love to be able to see kind of how maybe some Bible stories could be explained by science and rotate between those. Obviously, as we close, we want to invite people to remember that, as we mentioned before, this is something that we need to approach carefully and prayerfully, and that it's meant to be a way of dealing with questions. And what is this world meant to be? Not in necessarily the spiritual sense when talking about science, but, what does science teach us? Is that science correct? Is that something that we need to look into deeper? And, what can that mean for us as Christians, especially as some of those scientific findings affect our lives more deeply? The topic for next episode is going to be whether or not faith and science are indeed incompatible, or if they are compatible overall. We covered some of those topics today, but we'll go a little bit more in depth with that next time. So we hope to have you tune in and listen in then.